Day in Rio. And so when she called and asked me to come do a talk, and I thought, well, I'm happy to do that. And so we talked about some of the possibilities, and I'd actually done a talk at a Theology on Tap in New Albany on the 7 deadly sins. And I think it's something that, it has some popular appeal, the 7 deadly sins. There's a lot of, sort of some modern interest in that. These would have been sins that have been kind of formulated as this list kind of in the Middle Ages. So oddly enough, it's a very old list, and yet, or even before that, and yet in the modern world, there's been a good amount of interest in that. Have any of you ever seen the movie Seven with Brad Pitt, and Morgan Freeman? That idea of these 7 deadly sins. And then actually, I'm going to put it in a context in another author that sort of had a resurgence of popularity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 7 deadly sins in the context of Dante Alighieri, who wrote a work called The Divine Comedy, the first part of which is the most famous, Dante's Inferno, but there's actually 3 parts. And I'm going to make a statement right now that might seem like a bit of hyperbole, or might seem like a bit of an exaggeration, but I truly believe, and I think there are some professors of literature and some learned people in literature that would agree with me on this, that Dante represents, at least for the Catholic world, let's say at least for the Catholic world, the single greatest work of literature in Western civilization. I certainly think that, and I'm including the Iliad and the Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid, that what Dante represents is sort of the height of our culture's understanding of art in its written form. And so Dante would have been around at the very early 14th century, the very early 1300s and the late 1200s. And why I say that is because, at least for us Catholics, our understanding of the Catholic imagination, of our ability to reach out and understand God in the arts, it certainly has its architectural form. It has its form in the visual arts and paintings and music, but it also has its literary form. And I think Dante represents the best that we've ever produced, the height of that, because Dante represents our understanding of the universe, of God's creation. That at the name of Jesus, every knee under the earth, think Dante's Inferno, on the earth, think Dante's Purgatorio, which is actually a place on earth, and above the earth, Dante's Paradiso, that he takes into his work all of creation, and he takes in everything that came before him, all the great works of literature from the ancient world, from Homer and Virgil. Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, who's the great Latin poet, is actually in this work as his guide through hell and through purgatory, which we're going to be talking about, and these 7 deadly sins. And then, so not only does he take in all the great works of the ancient culture, but then he sort of synthesizes that, and our understanding that everything in our universe works towards God's providence. And everyone, whether they know it or not, works towards God's providence. And in the afterlife, which is what Dante's work concerns, ultimately every knee bends in the name of Christ. That's sort of the completion of God's providence, that we all, at some point, no matter where our journey in this life was, we all come to realize the fullness of truth. Hopefully having participated in that. And so, that's just kind of my spiel on Dante, because, or at least to justify why I would talk about why I think it's so important that, that we get this Italian poet back. And and as I said, in our, he sort of had a resurgence. In our world, Dante's Inferno is a very well-known and popular work. I think there was a video game that was just made about Dante's Inferno and a movie in the works. The first part, which is about hell, which is about Dante's journey through hell. And I think I heard it said once that to know the Divine Comedy, to know this 3-part work only by the Inferno, is like knowing Paris, but only by its sewers. That the Inferno is perhaps the most graphic and currently the most popular, but it's not, in my opinion, the best of the 3. In fact, the best of the 3 is probably the 3rd part, is Dante's description of paradise, the Paradiso. And a close second is the Purgatorio, because for us, Dante shows these 7 deadly sins. He goes through each sin in the form of a mountain. For him, purgatory is a mountain that each soul must climb. And each soul begins on that mountain at the base with the first sin we'll talk about, and moves its way up, spending as little or as much time in each level as is needed, depending on how much that sin had control over our lives. One of the names for the 7 deadly sins also is the 7 cardinal sins, because all other sin, all other human attempt to turn away from God, to turn in on ourselves, has its root somewhere in one of those 7 deadly sins. And another thing about Dante is that while he was a poet, he was an Italian. He actually wrote in Italian, not in Latin, which was revolutionary at his time. So he wrote in the vernacular for the people to be able to read. He was also a pretty eminent theologian. And in fact, one of the best professors I had at Marian University, Nick, I'm sure you remember Dr. Dins, told us one time that if you want to know Thomas Aquinas, who was probably the church's preeminent theologian, if you want to know St. Thomas in an artistic form, look at Dante. That Dante understood Thomas perhaps better than any of even the theologians at his time. That he was a Thomist. So at this time in our history of a church, this sort of the height of our theological understanding in Thomas, and it's in that expression of what we believe, Dante then came along and put it in an artistic form. And so in many ways, the Divine Comedy is an understanding of Catholic theology in its fullest. The understanding of our ultimate goal, of what holds us back, the inferno of how sin destroys us, the purgatorio of how we can be purged of sin, and then the paradiso of the rewards, of the glory of actually overcoming sin and experiencing the glory of God through His grace. So then without any further ado, let's go through the purgatorio. And how this works, as I said, it's a 7-story mountain. And each level or story has a sin. And at each level then, Dante gives us his vision of a punishment for that sin. But the point of that is, and this is the same way in the Inferno, but the sins in purgatory, the punishments, we can almost think of them as penances. Ways in which these sins can be countered. Or at least showing us an example of the opposite of each of these 7 sins, and then how that can affect, like how we could participate in overcoming those sins even in this life. That's what these souls undergo in purgatory, to be purged of the sin. So he says the sin, he says the punishment, and then he gives an example of what's called the reign of the sin, or the chief sin. An example either from history, from mythology, or from the Bible, of who Dante thinks is the ultimate example of someone that fell to this sin. And then each sinner then is either shown that, or they hear that spoken to them, or they hear a quote from that person, depending on what their punishment is. And then they're given the virtue that counters that sin. So for the 7 deadly sins, each one is paired with a virtue, one of the 7 virtues that can help us overcome that sin, if that sin is one that really holds us back from God. And then he actually goes through each sin and he gives an example of that virtue in Mary's life. An example from the life of the Blessed Mother that ultimately would counter that sin, would be the exact opposite of that sin. As a human being, Mary is the exemplar of all virtue. And so for each sin, a scene from her life taken from Scripture that shows her countering that sin. Now sometimes these have to stretch a bit, but they're all of them ultimately, if you really think about it, make sense. And then a beatitude. As the soul leaves each level, he passes through a gate in which that sin is completely purged once and for all, and he hears one of the beatitudes that Jesus preached at the Sermon on the Mount. A beatitude that again sort of exemplifies how that sin can be overcome. So let's start then. At the base, level 1 of this mountain, and the first level that Dante sees, is pride. The first of the 7 deadly sins. Now if you think about the mountain as like a layer cake almost, like a spiral, the bottom is going to be the largest, and then it gets more narrow as it goes up, like a cone almost. So pride, for Dante, pride is the largest of all the deadly sins as far as the area on purgatory and the base. And so which tells us then ultimately, and this is certainly true, that pride, as we know, is the root of all evil. Pride is the satanic sin. Pride is the first sin committed by any creature, by Lucifer himself. When he refused to submit to the will of God, when he refused to worship Christ because Christ becoming man, because that attacked his pride as an angel. As the highest created being, he couldn't fathom that God himself would become a man. And and pride, I think, and this is something that I think is so that Dante does so well. In the Inferno, by the way, is an inversion of purgatory. So what's at the bottom of purgatory is also at the bottom of the Inferno. And pride is at the deepest pit of hell. Because pride is ultimately a sin of our spirit, which Dante and which Thomas would say, sins of the spirit are even worse than sins of the flesh. And in fact, St. Thomas says that God will sometimes allow us to fall into sins of the flesh, things that Dante puts at the top, sins like lust, sins like gluttony, those kind of things, that God will allow us to more readily fall into those sins as we move along the spiritual life, so that we can realize our complete dependence on God to overcome them. Ultimately then, so that pride can be overcome. That this deep root, of things, so much, for those of us who are really trying hard to live a good Catholic Christian life, so many of our sins that are sort of visible, these, sins of the body, things that we try and overcome but fall again and again, are almost like branches on a tree that we continually prune. We continually cut these branches, and yet we never really get at getting at the roots, which Dante is telling us is pride, is this first sin. This sin that the creatures put themselves in some sense on the level of the Creator, even subconsciously. It's the same sin of Adam and Eve. That their sin of eating that apple, that you'll become like God. That was the temptation in that sin. If you understand good and evil, you'll become like God, and God knows that. That's why He doesn't want you to have that. That us thinking that our will is the most important thing in our life. That we know where we need to go. We know what we need to do next. We know what's good for us. That when things don't go our way, then the whole world seems to collapse. Or even thinking that if we have something, an obstacle in our life, that we can overcome it. That we don't need anyone's help. We certainly don't need any other human being's help, and we might pay lip service to needing God's help. But we don't really take that to heart. But that's pride. The human being trying to do what only God can do. And after the fall, I'm sorry to say that's virtually nothing. There's virtually nothing that's good that we can't do without God's grace. And so, for Dante, he puts this on the base of the mountain because for him, almost every soul has to go here. And keep in mind, I don't want to go too much into the theology of purgatory because that's a whole other talk. But purgatory is for sins that have already been forgiven, but the effects of which, the temporal effects, still stain the soul or still hold us back. The eternal punishment for the sin, which would be for immortal sin, which would be hell, is remitted. Christ takes that away when we seek forgiveness, but the temporal punishment, so eternal versus temporal, the temporal punishment might still stay on the soul. And so for Dante, those of us who are forgiven of sins, those of us who achieve salvation, it's just after the fall, pride is such a basic human thing. It's such a basic, not human thing, but it's such a basic tool of the evil one to bring us back. That that you don't need God, or that that your plan for your life, where you want to be. For myself, it was overcoming pride is the only way that I went into seminary, because I wanted to go to IU and I wanted to go to Kelly School of Business, and I wanted to go, and for me that was just the normal thing to do, and I couldn't fathom any other plan outside of that. And so I'm sure each of us have had experience of that before, where our plan tends to clash with God's plan at times, and ultimately that's pride. And so the punishment for pride then that Dante envisions as Dante goes through each level, he sees these people being purified of these sins. The punishment is they have to crawl face down in the dirt, weighed down by rocks. And the size of the rock depends on the amount that pride ruled their lives. And as they crawl towards the exit of this level, the rocks get smaller and smaller. And as and so again, think of pride as us trying to puff ourselves up to be like God, and the penance of which is for us to, in humility, which by the way is the virtue that counters pride, obviously, in humility, to sort of recognize who we are as creatures. So as these souls are crawling on the ground with rocks on their back, they see the rain, the chief sinner. They see inscriptions of him in the ground. And the rain for pride, the chief sinner for pride is Nimrod, who in the Old Testament is the king that tried to build the Tower of Babel. The king, and so they see images of this tower which symbolizes man's attempt to reach to the heavens through our own power to build our way to heaven, to become like God. And as you know from that, God scattered the nations of the earth and confused our tongues. That's the story of the Old Testament, which is only overcome in Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit comes. And so Nimrod, the king, who was believed to be the first king of Babylon, and built the tower at Shinar, which is where the Tower of Babel was. And so the virtue then that they're told, the virtue that they are being purified with is humility, as I said. And the example from the life of Mary then is from the Annunciation, and it's her response. It's her response to receiving, as I said, Satan is the highest creature ever created. So Lucifer was the highest creature by nature. Mary then, at the Annunciation, became the highest creature by grace. That God then, by asking her to accept him into her own self, to accept his son into her womb, by saying yes, she eclipsed even where Lucifer was. Lucifer was created in this high state. She went to that high state because of grace. And her response to that was one of absolute humility. And so they hear as they're crawling, "Behold the handmaid of God." They hear her response to the Annunciation, her response of pure humility, as she received that news that she would become the most exalted human being of all time. And yet pride did not overcome her, like it did the first Eve, like it did Lucifer himself, that pure humility. And then as they leave this level, as they pass through the gate, as they're purged, they hear the beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so you can kind of see how it fits. And again, we'll talk about this more later, but pride itself is the base of this mountain. The root, really any sin that comes after this, pride has some level of it. Because any sin turning from God to ourselves is in some sense an act of pride, even if there are other things that are attached to it. So, after pride then, Dante and Virgil go to the second level, which is envy. And the punishment of those whose chiefs, the punishment, the penance for envy is that their eyes are sewn shut with wire, with metal wire. And they're forced to lean on each other for support. And so the idea is that these who spent their lives looking at other people with envy, envying what other people had, or envying what other people could do, are now forced to get through this level with each other. They can't see. And it's an incredibly painful image of your eyes being sewn shut with wire. So they have to grasp each other and bring each other in, and then that's the only way they can progress. Envy, as I said, it's kind of obvious. We envy other people's things, but more so than that, we envy other people's state in life. We envy someone that has better jobs, someone that, and ultimately Dante's point in this, and the reason for making the punishment that they have to lean on each other, is that the entire human race is ultimately one family. Is ultimately, as Dante says it, we're all sons of Adam, we're all daughters of Eve. And and especially amongst those of us in the church, when we see gifts in someone else, when we see someone else's abilities, when we see God blessing someone else, that should cause us joy. That's ultimately the response of virtue, is that we respond in joy to seeing good things happen to other people. But sin, which turns us on ourselves, then perverts that into causing us to be envious and to, almost hating the other person because they have what we don't. And the chief sinner for this one is also an Old Testament figure. Anybody have a guess? The Old Testament figure who's the chief sinner of envy? One of the original human beings, one of the first three. Cain. So when Abel and Cain each gave their gift to God, God, it says, looked favorably on Abel's, more so than, and so instead of rejoicing in that, instead of rejoicing in his brother's great feat, Cain turns to envy and slays his brother. And in fact, since their eyes are sewn shut, they can't see this scene, so they actually hear a voice crying out, "Everyone that findeth me shall slayeth me," which is what Cain says when God cast him out. And he puts the mark, and then God puts a mark on him as a response. So they hear that over and over again. Everyone that finds me will kill me, because he's been cast out from the original. He's been cast out from that original family, and it was his envy. And so the virtue that counters that then is charity. And again, this. I think the symbolism here doesn't have to be absolute. That charity counters much more than just envy. But charity, sharing in the supernatural love of God for others is the opposite of only thinking about ourselves in relationship to others, the opposite of envy. And so the virtue is the opposite of that. And then the example for Mary's life is at the wedding feast of Cana, and they hear her saying they have no wine. There's a word in Greek that I can't remember that we don't have in English, and it's when we relish in someone that we envy or someone that we don't like, when we relish in their anguish. So if you think about someone you're jealous of, or someone you've ever been jealous of, and you see them trip on their face or fail, then that's sort of like the joy that you get out of that, that which is a response of envy ultimately, even if we don't admit it to ourselves. Mary, when she saw this family run out of wine, her response was to turn to Christ and say, "Fix this, help them," instead of relishing in the defeat of someone else or in the embarrassment of someone else. And so her turning and then her not thinking of herself, but wanting to prop up those around us, and ultimately then the beatitude then as they leave this level, and again this is probably a bit of a stretch, but blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. And if you think about showing someone mercy is a response that comes out of the opposite of envying that person, of looking at that person as a fellow human being, and since as someone else that just like us that we want to see succeed, that we want to see do well in this life, that showing them mercy is a response of that. It's a response of charity, for that, and that's Dante's point. And so again, that sin of envy that can turn us against each other is Dante's point for that, which again is why the punishment they must hold each other to get through. So that's the second deadly sin. So we have pride and then envy. And again, think of as we go up the mountain, these sins become more narrow, meaning that they become more specified. But again, these sins underneath of them, in some sense, unrelated. So the third sin is wrath, or sometimes just called anger or extreme anger, wrath. And the punishment for these souls is that they wander in a dense and poisonous fog that obscures all light. And that's to symbolize what wrath does to us. Wrath clouds. Wrath is a response of the will that tries to supersede any response of the reason. So we don't think. You get so angry at something or so emotionally charged at something, the intellect is clouded over in a dense fog and we just act. And think of any time in your life, in my own life, I could think, anytime you reacted in wrath, and then you think about it later and you think, why did I do that? You think, it's almost like being in a fog, where you lose the ability to reason. And and this can be everything from physical to, but even more than that, and I think in our world today, especially for those of us who try and live our faith, who try and go about our lives as Catholics, that everything is so polemical these days. In the church, in the government, everywhere. So there's the left and the right. There is the conservative Catholics, the liberal Catholics, and then and then we tend to interact with each other in politics, in Washington, in state politics, and even in our own church. In a sense, we tend to act without really thinking through arguments, which means we act in wrath. We act with extremes. We act by lashing out. We act in a dense fog. Now, the chief sinner for this one, Dante draws on a rather graphic image, but it's a great image of wrath from mythology, and that's Procne. And Procne was a mythological character who punished her husband for raping her sister by feeding him their son. So apparently there was a myth along these lines. I think her husband was a king, and he took her sister forcefully and they conceived a son. And so Procne in this dense fog of wrath does something unthinkable. Feeds him this and disguises it as an animal meat. Feeds him the baby. Think of it. There could be and they see this story in their minds, seeing something so horrible and something so obviously wrathful, so obviously devoid of any reason, helps them realize just how foolish acting in wrath is. So the virtue that counters wrath then is meekness. They're told to be meek. And the example from the life of Mary is the finding in the temple. Because again, as we're told, in her fear that she had lost Christ when she finally finds him, she does not react in wrath. She says where were you? How can you do this to us? But then when he says, didn't you know I should be in my Father's house? That her reaction is not how a mother's reaction would have been, which was an extreme, so acting and being guided by our reason instead of being guided by our emotions. That's the point there, defining in the temple. And then, as I said, since the virtue to counter this is meekness, not surprisingly, the Beatitude is blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. And so, and I think, in Dante's time, he has a lot more examples of this. In his time, it was much more common, especially in Italy. If you've ever seen The Sopranos or The Godfather, you kind of understand this, to act in wrath when feuds come up. And in Florence, the amount of murders and the amount of things like that he would have seen. So for him, this is a big one. And for us, I think, stepping back a bit from the physical wrath of killing or beating each other, that there is a certain amount of polemical or of, reacting harshly in a way that would shut someone else off in an argument. I know I've been there before, where someone that disagrees with me, instead of trying to meet them where they are and bring them somewhere, you're just an idiot. You can't figure this out. This and that. And that reaction and wrath. So I think it's still relevant to us, even if we're not throwing daggers in each other's backs, like Dante was literally saying his neighbors do to each other in Italy. Okay, so that's the third level. Yes. It's a good question. Humility. Think of humility like a spiritual, that our spiritual understanding of ourselves before God, and meekness as a charity of sort of our rational. Holding back our anger, and not reacting ultimately they're all of them would be connected, but to be meek is more of a temperament. To be humble is more of a spiritual disposition. We can be humble but not meek. Well, really you couldn't, but humility then is our spiritual reaction to who we are before God, and to be meek is our temperament of not reacting in anger towards each other or towards something that when we believe we've been wrong. When Christ was wrong himself, he never reacted in anger. Now, when he saw other people being wrong, that's when he would get angry. That's when he would draw a line in the sand or turn tables over when he thought that God's house was being wrong. And so that meekness of allowing ourselves to be guided by our intellect instead of our will. It's kind of a good way to put it. By what we know we should do instead of what would feel good at the time. But again, they're pretty well connected. Okay, so now we've gone on to the fourth level as we climb up, and this is sloth or laziness, or I think there's a fancy name for it, but I can't remember. So sloth. I like this one. The punishment, the penance for the slothful is that they have to just run a marathon. They continually run. And there are people there are angels behind the pack that make sure they keep running. Whether they want to or not, And so that's a very physical example of that. And sloth doesn't just have to be in the physical realm. It doesn't have to just be lack of physical exertion. Sloth certainly has a spiritual element as well. But I think, the idea of that run, of being in motion, is a good idea for that. And the chief sinners that they're shown are the laggard Hebrews who follow Moses into the wilderness from Egypt, but then complain and murmur the whole time that they actually had it better back there. We actually had it better with Pharaoh than we do under you, because with you we're just wandering. And so this idea that this sort of laziness, spiritual laziness, physical laziness kind of played out with them. And so the virtue then that counters sloth is zeal. Is and so our zeal in spiritual matters, our zeal in evangelization, our zeal in physical matters, and taking care of our bodies, all that's involved. The example for Mary's life is the visitation. So having received the news that she conceived the Son of God, having received the news that she would bear Jesus, she immediately goes to her sister Elizabeth. She brings Christ in her out. She doesn't just keep it in for herself, So you have the image of Mary running to Bethany, in her great zeal to share this message. And for all of us then, for all of us who have received the grace of faith in Christ, who have, in a sense, received Christ into our own hearts, zeal then pushes us out from ourselves. Zeal brings us out into the world to share that with people. The opposite of sloth, which in the spiritual sense would just, we would sort of take that and then sort of sit at home, basically. And, or at least not do the things that we need to do to share that message because they're hard. Not just because they're physically taxing, which is one element, but also because they're difficult. That's a reaction of sloth. That's a reaction of that deadly sin. And so the beatitude on this one, and this is again some explanation. It's blessed are they who mourn, for they shall be comforted. If you think about sloth, and how that would fit with blessed are they who mourn, but a spiritual and a human example of sloth is apathy. Is a complete and total apathy towards that which is around you. You're apathetic about sharing the gospel. You're apathetic about other people's pain. You don't care. You're just spiritually being slothful means that what you see, what you take in, you just sort of, that's their problem, not mine. That's this and that. So mourning, which is a reaction of empathy, is sort of the opposite of apathy in that sense. Mourning brings you out of yourself and concern for others. And so I think Dante's point in saying that beatitude, blessed are they who mourn, is that the slothful person is empathetic, cares about other people. Or the zealous person is empathetic, cares about other people. He's not apathetic. He doesn't just sort of sit in a daze, not caring about people. Again, like I said, there's, and for myself, now that since I've been ordained, I think, there's, being zealous for the faith is one thing, but then for all of us, there's something. I can tell you my healthy habits of working out and that kind of thing are plummeted, that kind of thing. So, sloth physical, sloth is starting to move in. And so it's just something that there's always that balance. There's both aspects of it. And so, I'm sure some of us have been there. That I know it's good for me to go out and run right now, or I know it's good for me to go evangelize right now, but wouldn't it just be much nicer just to stay in bed? So wouldn't it be, so that's why the souls are told to run in the sloth. And I can give you, let's talk about for gluttony. So never mind. So that's the fourth level. So we have pride, envy, wrath, sloth. After hearing that beatitude being purged, then greed. Greed on the fifth level. And greed, specifically greed for wealth. Greed for taking in the things of this world. More so than envy. Envy doesn't have to necessarily involve wealth. Envy can be, for envying someone else's success. Greed is specific to valuing the things in this world more than the spiritual things in the next. And so the punishment for those who are being purged of greed is that they're paralyzed, they can't move, and they're bound face down in the dust. The earth is in their face. And the idea is that you value the things of this world so much that I'm going to show you what that's worth. And so there's the mud. Put your face in the mud and look at it. Look at the world that you thought was so much more important than God himself. And so the chief sinner for this, again, is taken from Theology. And this is a good one too, I think. And it's Midas. Midas, who wished that everything he touched would be turned to gold. And because of his greed for wealth, and then accidentally touches his own daughter and kills her by turning her into gold, that it destroys him. And it destroys those around him. And so the idea of greed, that we can be jealous of a lot of things. We can be greedy for a lot of things. We can be greedy for wealth, but there's also a certain amount of greed for time. And this kind of goes with sloth, that we think our own time, we think our own free time, our own leisure is so important that anything else that gets in its way, especially if God wants us to do something, then to hell with that. And that's a form of greed. Being greedy for time. Not just being greedy for wealth, which is kind of obvious where that is. That touches us as well. And there's also the sense of greed of always having to have the newest and the best and the latest and the greatest. And I fall into this too. I have the latest iPhone. Did I need it? No. But and so I think we all, that can certainly happen with anything. So with time or with wealth or those things that, and again, think of Dante's image of these things that you value so much are nothing more than dirt compared to what actually matters. So the virtue that counters that then is simplicity of life. And again, there are other names for that virtue, simplicity. But that attached. So, and Dante and certainly the church have never said that things in this world, owning things, having things, is in and of itself bad. God created the world, and the riches of the world are not bad. It's when they become more important to us than our final goal. And those things that God has given us become what's so important. So simplicity of life speaks to our detachment from it. We're not all called to be monks, to literally give everything up, which is a great calling. But for those of us who live in the world, we have to own things, we have to have things, we have to have property, we have to, but not allowing them to conquer who we are, not allowing that to be the only goal that we have, is what Dante is speaking of when he says simplicity of life. And the example from Mary's life is nativity, the birth. This woman who's to give birth to the King of Kings gave birth in a manger. Either you think of it as a cave or as a stable, as the lowliest possible place she could have, if the Mother of God herself had such a humble and lowly place to give birth, who are we to think that all these other things that matter so little are so important? That's Dante's point here. And so for the Beatitude then, he splits this Beatitude between this and the next one. He said, blessed are they who thirst for righteousness, as opposed to blessed are they who thirst for the things of this world. Blessed are those who thirst for gold, for money. And again, as an Italian in the Renaissance, Dante would have seen this firsthand, but it's not unique to his time. Since the apple core hit the bushes in the garden, since the fall, this is not a human thing. That we confuse the gifts that God has given us with the goal of human life. And it's important to realize anything we're given, anything we've acquired as far as wealth, is given to us so that God can use us through it to bless other people. Anything we're given beyond sustaining our own lives is an opportunity for us to share in God's answering other people's prayers. Is an opportunity for us to share in His work of grace so that we can bless other people with what we're blessed with. And so so to thirst for righteousness, to thirst for the things that matter instead of thirsting for the things that don't. So that's the fifth level. Any questions so far on the first five? We do questions.
All right, chop it up for me. Wrap up.
Okay, so now we're going to go up then to the sixth level, gluttony. And again, we're getting into overt sins of the body, gluttony. And for Dante, another good one, the punishment is that those in this level stand before these tall and beautiful trees starving. They're all from as hungry as you've ever been times 10. And the trees have beautiful fruit, big, huge, sumptuous fruits, but they're so tall and skinny and they're out of reach. The people can't get to them. They try and climb the stalks, they try and reach for them, they try and get on each other's shoulders and they can't. So they see what their body wants and they're denied it. And that's sort of the whole idea of penance. That, the idea of penance is that we take things that we physically want, that would cause us physical comfort, and we deny ourselves them temporarily or, at given times, Fridays during Lent, that kind of thing, so that we can train ourselves that our appetite doesn't rule.
Put her up.
So gluttony has an aspect in food, certainly. Gluttony has an aspect in drink, and it's probably the right bar, but with drink, these things are food. Food is good. Drink is not a bad thing. Drink, just like food, when taken in its proper context, is fine. But when our appetite then turns and starts to rule everything, when we respond to food and drink in gluttony, instead of out of the virtue, which is temperance, then those things can become the means of sin. Those things can then turn in and harm us, which is pretty clearly, from physically speaking. Now, the chief sinner here is that Dante gives. He wants to kind of give a familiar, obvious one, is Eve, who rejected God in favor of her appetite. Which it's a great symbol that the original sin was through a bite. That the original sin was through something. Not to say that her sin was it was an apple. It wasn't a double cheeseburger. So it wasn't necessarily an act of physical gluttony, but favoring her appetite for knowledge of good and evil ruled her, and Adam, not just her. It's Eve that they're shown that they sought to be like God, and it's a great symbol that they were brought down by their stomach. Because how many human beings have been brought down by their appetites? When you see it, and this also has an element an element with drugs as well. That when you see someone conquered through a gluttonous intake of something, it's incredibly sad. And, it's incredibly obvious. An alcoholic or a drug addict or someone that is, someone who's morbidly obese or something, that it's such a sad to see the human being brought to that level by their own appetite.
Yeah, it's underneath everything.
Again, the virtue is temperance. Because again, these things are not, those things that we can turn to in gluttony are not in and of themselves bad. And temperance, the virtue of temperance gives us the proper context to take things in moderation and, in the way that we should. And again, from the life of Mary, just like envy was from the wedding of Cana, speaking of they have no wine, gluttony is also from the wedding of Cana. And they hear Mary say, do whatever he tells you. And again, Dante is giving us the example that the Son of God turned water into wine. That things in this life can be enjoyed in their proper season. That's why we're having Theology on Tap right now. Not all Christians understand that. I think most Baptists would be horrified if they thought of the idea of Theology on Tap. That we would actually meet in a bar. So again, we have this example from Mary's own life where she says he's going to turn water into wine. But that's and that's a good thing that we can enjoy and that we can have in temperance. That's the whole idea. And that's the struggle of being human, of taking things in. And so the Beatitude then, blessed are they who hunger for righteousness, the other half of the first one, for hunger for righteousness instead of only think of hungering to satisfy themselves. So finally, we have the final level. The one we have left, we have pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and finally lust. And the punishment here, here's where you get your traditional image of purgatory. The punishment is fire. They walk in fire. There's a lot of things going on here. For one, fire, the idea of purging, and of our passions having a sort of burning effect. You know what I mean? That, and that I think that being tied closely to lust. It's interesting. Dante, again, this is 14th century. Dante has two rings of people walking through this fire being purged of lust. One ring is walking clockwise. Those are the heterosexuals. One ring is walking counterclockwise. Those are homosexuals. The important thing here, they're both in purgatory, which means they're both saved. To be in purgatory is to be saved. And here you have, if you think that the church's understanding of, that people that like to stereotype and say, well, the church says, that sexuality is, that, to be homosexual, that you're going to hell, or if you have any sort of desire that you're going to hell. This has never been the case in our theology. That both of these are being purged in the same fire, because both are called to chastity. We happen to believe that homosexuals are also called to celibacy, but both, the important thing is that both are called to chastity, and that both then are purged of sins of lust in this fire. And again, and so let's just finish it and all. So the virtue is charity, is chastity, obviously. The example from Mary's life, they hear again at the Annunciation. So pride we have the Annunciation, her saying, behold the handmaid of the Lord. Here we hear her saying, but I know not a man. Her purity, her complete celibate chastity. When the angel said, you're going to conceive a son, her response is, out of her chastity. But how is that? Because I know not a man. And so they are given Mary as the ultimate example of chastity and purity. And then as they pass through this fire, they hear, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. And so again, I think this is kind of, ever since really the Victorian era, I think, in our culture, things have been kind of, people are confused by this. Most people would turn it upside down. They would put lust at the bottom. They would put, especially those who really try and live out religious lives. That lust tends to be something that we worry about the most, that we talk about the most, and Dante puts it as the smallest level of purgatory. And for him, it's the closest of the deadly sins to love, which is a good thing. In hell, lust is at the very top, and it's the least harshly punished of any of them. They're blown about in hell by an endless tempest, just as in life they were blown about by their inordinate sexual desires. And so I think that what Dante is saying with putting gluttony and lust, these things that we can see really well, these things that, or at least that cause the most shame, I think, in people. Because of all these deadly sins, for some of them, our society has all but told us greed's a good thing. And sloth, if you can live a life where you're able to be slothful and get by, then you've succeeded. Gluttony and lust, at least still, well, even lust is starting to lose this, but at least carry a certain element of shame because they're so, at least in those of us that are trying to live good lives, when we fail in that regard, when we fail especially when we fall to lust, for all its many things, Dante's telling us that more than likely there's a pride at the root of that. There's something deeper down on the mountain that we need to address, to truly overcome that, turning ourselves over to God. And so that's why he put lust at the top, but that's also why he puts it through a fire. Probably the most intense of all the punishments of the purifying, because it's also the most intense of all the, is felt, this sin is felt and pulls us most intensely. Because again, it comes closest to our sharing in the divine life of creation. Our sexuality is so close to God's act of creation that it's so part of being human that it's such that the perversion of it, lust, is so powerful. So then Dante gets to the top of the mountain. So I should say, lust is the top ring. There's actually like a plateau on the top. And interestingly, this is where he puts the Garden of Eden. This is where man was created. On the top of all this. This is where actually man was meant to be in nature. Up to this point, this is overcoming these sins, living in these virtues. Dante is saying that had man never fallen, we would have been in this state of having been pure in our nature. And then from there, from this garden, so Dante sees the tree, he sees how beautiful, and he has this big discourse on how could Adam and Eve reject this, having been here. They were the only human beings that were created there. Everyone else had to get back to it. And how do we get back to it? How do we climb back to what was lost? Is through Christ. Christ brings us back to the original. Only through Christ now can we achieve what was meant to be achieved naturally. And then once they get there, once they get to the garden, to the height of man's natural state, that's the end of the purgatorio. Then they go where only grace could ever have taken us, which is into paradise. Then he's, having been purified, and this is the sort of the positive thing of purgatory, having been brought back to the state before the fall, then God reaches down even more so and pulls Dante into heaven. And so, there's so much that can be said for that, but I think it's an interesting image. That the Garden of Eden was something that Adam and Eve basically jumped out of, and then we spend, and again, Dante's point is purgatory doesn't have to be in the next life, it can be in this life. We can do this climbing now. That's why he shows us these acts of penances. That's why he gives us these virtues that, we try in this life. And then for those things that we're sorry for, if we haven't completely overcome them, if we haven't completely been purified of those sins, and then God in his mercy gives us this mountain that we can climb into the next life. That's purgatory. And so then I won't, so again, a whole talk could be given on the Paradiso, a whole talk could be given on the Inferno. That's the structure of the Purgatorio. How are we on time? Have I gone over? I don't remember. It's 8:20. You go to 8:30? Is that right? Any questions or anything?
I thought it was pretty cool for envy and wrath, the two sinners you named, Cain and that lady from Mythology. Pretty brutal murderers. Pretty brutal murderers, but still on their way to heaven.
Exactly. Right. Well, yeah. And they, and for some of them, like for Procne, it's more of someone that didn't really even exist, but just to show us what wrath can do, and yet can still be overcome. Right. Yeah. And so again, with him pulling in things from myth, isn't, his point isn't necessarily to bring historical fact forward, but to show us, from the great myths of ancient, that humans have always had an understanding of what wrath does. That's why we had these myths in the first place. Procne was never held up as a good example of virtue. And so that Dante is just showing us how this has always been working in God's providence, even before we knew it. And again, in purgatory, the punishments are meant to purify, they're meant to be penance. In hell, in the Inferno, so for gluttony, they see this and they hunger. And in the Inferno, they're ultimately given what they wanted, and they wallow in filth. They're laying on their backs and they can't shut their mouths. And basically, feces and vomit and filth is just dumped on them. And so they're just, so gluttony punishes them instead of purifies them. They spend eternity choking on filth, which is, so it can be very graphic, but at the same time, the symbolism is meant to show us, the true nature of what sin does. And then the true nature of what penance does, helping us overcome sin.
purgatory.
Right, yeah.
I mean, other than perhaps prayer and confession, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, have you ever heard the phrase offered up? Particularly Catholic phrase. You know, that our daily sufferings, things that we go through in this life, suffering does not have to be meaningless. And in fact, as far as in my best estimation, our understanding of purgatory, our understanding of being purged of the temporal punishment for sin, that's one of the only things that can really give meaning to suffering in this life. Because that's how we unite our sufferings to the suffering of Christ on the cross. You know, and then we get to share in His work of redemption. Only Christ can overcome the eternal punishment for sin. But He wants us to partake in overcoming the temporal punishment for it. You know, and that's why, you know, and so not all suffering is redemptive, because not all suffering is offered up. Some people suffering through it, they become jaded, or they don't, you know, they become angry, and out of pride, they think this shouldn't be happening to me. You know, but again, just going through life and, you know, and taking the hardships that we're given and seeking out things that stretch us. You know, so not necessarily seeking out suffering, but seeking out things that extend us beyond our comfort zone in charity and in reaching out to people and that kind of thing. Those things can be offered up. That's why the church has the practice of either offering up your suffering for yourself or for a loved one in purgatory. And then if you want to get into the formal way of doing that, then we have indulgences. And that's the whole point of indulgences, either obtained for myself or obtained for a loved one or for just anyone in purgatory. That we can share with Christ and His work on the cross in some way. And in doing so, we grow closer to Him. So offering up daily suffering, you know, saying, and it's just, it takes an act of the will. It takes an act of your will saying, God, I'm taking what I'm going through right now and I'm offering this in reparation for my sins. Or I'm offering this in reparation for the sins of the deceased. You know, a conscious act of doing that can be a way of redemption, can be a way of sharing in this life. And as Catholics don't believe that every soul that goes to heaven has to go through purgatory. In fact, I think that, those who have been canonized saints, those greatest examples of saints, semi-live saints, especially the martyrs who died for their faith, who received that, their suffering in this life, and then they get to achieve salvation. And so that's another great thing about the Catholic understanding of Christ, is that we can achieve, in some measure, what we were meant for at our creation in the garden in this life. You know what I mean? Like, only through Christ we can get back to what was intended, to that state of glory, to that state of natural bliss in this life. Now, not perfectly, because not only is the world stained by sin, but each and every one of us is stained by sin in some way. So yeah, purgatory doesn't have to all wait for the next life. And but again, as I said, purgatory and that sharing in that is for things for which we have already been forgiven. So we can't do something and then work our way to forgiveness. You couldn't, you couldn't murder someone and then do 10,000 works of charity and overcome that. Being forgiven is an act of asking for it and receiving that grace. So anything in suffering, if it's to be offered up, we have to already ask for forgiveness for sins. And this is where the whole abuse with indulgences came in, where people began to believe they could buy their way out of sins by donating a large sum of money, which is a good and charitable act, but then that somehow that would actually forgive the sin. That's not the case. Only Christ forgives the sin, only when we ask for it. But once the sin's forgiven, if I break someone's window, He can forgive me, but I might want to help pay for the window. You know what I mean? So once the sin's forgiven, then we can do our part as human beings and share in that with Christ. I think that's a particularly Catholic understanding of it. But it certainly gives meaning to suffering. It certainly gives meaning, it certainly brings us closer to Jesus, who was on the cross. Any other questions?
How do you deal with most vulnerable in the moment situations? Because virtues are good long-term solutions.
Right.
But you're weak when you're actually facing that.
It's a good question. And virtue, as Thomas describes it, is a habit, is a disposition of the will towards good. And so for any of these, you're right, virtues are good in the long run, but virtues are meant to be things that actually become ingrained in us as habits. And it tends to be in moments, in the like in the great moments of test, or like in the great moments where, where we tend to act on our habits. If you are habitually disposed towards one of the deadly sins, when the temptation for lust arises, you will tend to choose it. But if you trained yourself in virtue, so for lust, let's say, take the image of fire, if you've sort of allowed yourself to feel the burning of passion and yet oriented it, towards its proper end, for human sexuality then, to be expressed in marriage so that we can share in God's life-giving action. If that's become your habit, in other words, if you brought that virtue into yourself, then the whole point is in times of temptation, then you will tend to choose the virtue. And so our whole life is kind of on a balance then, trying to work our way towards that. And that's the other thing about human action. Every moral action pulls you in one direction. Just like, so let's take something more obvious than with gluttony. If someone puts all-you-can-eat buffet in front of you, if you've never tried to diet, if you've never tried to hold yourself back from things, if you've never trained yourself in the virtue of temperance, then it's more than likely you're going to fall into the sin of gluttony at that point, because that's your habit. As Thomas would say, your habitual disposition is to choose it. And so the nice thing about purgatory is that you're separated from the body. So once you've gone through this, once you've been purified, then you're not necessarily going to be tempted anymore. And whereas in this life you have to move towards that. But as far as sin itself, if we, to go through this life, to work out your faith in fear and trembling, as St. Paul says, to work at it, is ultimately decision after decision after decision of choosing the good. And as you do that, then it becomes easier to choose the good. Just like working out. It becomes easier to work out. You can lift more weight the more you work out. Just like if you, after decision chose the bad, then you'll lean towards that. So the whole life is kind of which way does your habit draw you? And how do you overcome temptation? Ultimately, though, it's all grace too, especially after the fall. When we choose the good, it's because of God. And so again, pride can set in. And look how good I've been. I've been to 5 all-you-can-eat buffets and I only had one helper. Because I'm so strong or something like that. You know what I mean? That we also have to realize that no matter what it is, that virtue is a supernatural, especially those virtues of those are things now that God has given us. And there are supernatural virtues that God always would have had to have given us, like charity. And then there are natural virtues that we would have had mankind never fallen. But that having fallen, that God again has to get back to us. With our participation, though, it's God wants us to participate. It's not just it pleases God for us to work with Him and through Him, and as opposed to just to take away our will and just have us be recipients and not respond to it. So it's a good question. So the best way to overcome temptation is to have built the habit to do so, which is done through every little act. Any questions? That's about an hour. So thank you all very much. That's very good.